I once worked as an overnight caregiver for an elderly man named Henry, who was 70 years old and had advanced Alzheimer's. His son, David, had hired me because he worked long night shifts and needed someone to ensure his father was safe. I had experience working with patients with dementia, so I thought I knew what to expect. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. David introduced me to Henry earlier in the evening. Henry seemed quiet, sitting in his recliner, staring blankly at the TV. He barely acknowledged me when David explained that I'd be staying overnight to watch him. David warned me that Henry sometimes wandered around the house at night and could get confused or agitated. He told me to gently guide him back to bed if that happened. I assured him I could handle it. After David left, I settled into the living room, keeping an eye on Henry, who had dozed off in his chair. The house was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. Around 10 p.m., I helped Henry to his bedroom. He didn't say much, just mumbled incoherently as I guided him to bed. Once he was tucked in, I returned to the living room and turned on the TV to pass the time. About an hour later, I heard faint creaking sounds coming from the hallway. I muted the TV and listened. The creaking grew louder, and I realized it was footsteps. I got up and walked to the hallway, and then calling out, "Henry, are you okay?" There was no response. I turned the corner and saw him standing at the end of the hallway, facing the wall. His posture was stiff, and he wasn't moving. "Henry?" I said again, walking closer. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his face blank and his eyes wide. "Let's get you back to bed," I said gently, trying to guide him by the arm. But he pulled away and muttered something I couldn't understand. Then, without warning, he turned and walked into the kitchen. I followed him, concerned. When I entered the kitchen, I saw Henry standing by the sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard. I asked him again if he was okay, but he didn't respond. Instead, he started opening and closing the cabinet doors, one after another, slamming them shut with increasing force. The sound echoed through the house, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I cautiously approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Henry, let's go back to bed," I said softly. He stopped slamming the cabinets and turned to face me. His expression had changed. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was slightly open, as if he was in a trance. Then he whispered, "They're in the walls." My heart skipped a beat. "Who's in the walls, Henry?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past me and headed back down the hallway to his room. I followed him, making sure he got back into bed. Once he was lying down, I quietly shut his door and returned to the living room, feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter and convince myself it was just his dementia causing him to act that way. But I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to see him standing there again. Around 2 a.m., I decided to rest for a bit in the guest room David had set up for me. I left Henry's door slightly ajar so I could hear if he got up again. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was faint but persistent, like someone dragging something heavy. My heart started racing as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the hallway. I got up and slowly opened the door, peering out into the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the scraping sound continued. It was coming from Henry's room. I walked toward his door, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached it, I hesitated before pushing it open. The room was dark, but I could make out Henry's silhouette standing in the corner, facing the wall again. This time, he was holding something in his hand. I stepped closer and realized it was a large metal fire poker from the living room fireplace. "Henry, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he started tapping the fire poker against the wall, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was low and unsettling. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, he stopped tapping and turned to face me. His eyes looked wild, and he raised the fire poker slightly, as if he was about to swing it. "Henry, put that down," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step toward me, and I panicked. I backed out of the room and shut the door, holding it closed with all my strength. He started banging on the door from the other side, shouting incoherently. I grabbed my phone and called David, explaining what was happening. David told me he was on his way home and begged me not to call the police. I stayed by the door, listening to Henry's muffled shouts and the sound of the fire poker hitting the walls. After what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. I cautiously opened the door and saw Henry lying on his bed, the fire poker on the floor beside him. He was asleep, breathing heavily. When David arrived, I told him everything. He apologized profusely and assured me this had never happened before. I didn't stick around to hear more. I grabbed my things and left, vowing never to take another overnight caregiving job again. That night still haunts me, and I'll never forget the look in Henry's eyes as he stood there in the dark, muttering about things in the walls. It was my first week working for an electrical repair company. I was sent out on a call to a house on the outskirts of town. The company had a small team, and the boss assigned jobs randomly, or so he claimed. I couldn't help but feel like I was being sent to the least desirable jobs as the new guy. This particular call was for a faulty breaker box, which is usually a straightforward fix. When I arrived, the house looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I double-checked the address, and sure enough, it was the right place. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a man in his late 40s or early 50s answered. He had a gaunt face, sunken eyes, and a strange, almost forced smile. His voice was low and raspy, and he spoke slowly, as if he were carefully choosing every word. He invited me in, and I immediately noticed how empty the house was. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing. The air inside was stale, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the floorboards as we walked. I asked if he had just moved in, and he nodded, saying something about renovations. His tone was off, though, and his smile never wavered. It made me uneasy. He led me to the basement door and gestured for me to go down, saying the breaker box was in the basement. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't want to seem unprofessional, so I grabbed my tools and headed down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and the air was damp and musty. The breaker box was on the far wall, and as I approached it, I noticed something odd. There were no wires connected to it. It was completely empty, just a shell of a box. I turned around to ask the man about it, but he wasn't at the top of the stairs anymore. I called out, but there was no response. That's when I heard faint footsteps above me, moving quickly across the floor. Then, I heard another set of footsteps, heavier this time, coming from somewhere else in the house. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around the basement, looking for another way out, but there was nothing, just concrete walls and a few old rusted tools scattered on the floor. The footsteps upstairs grew louder, and I could hear muffled voices now, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I decided I wasn't sticking around to find out. I bolted up the stairs, my flashlight in one hand and my toolbox in the other. When I reached the main floor, the man was standing in the hallway, blocking the front door. His smile was gone now, replaced by a blank, almost menacing expression. I didn't say a word. I turned and ran toward the back of the house, hoping to find another exit. As I passed through the kitchen, I saw two more figures standing in the shadows, watching me. My adrenaline kicked in, and I threw open the back door and sprinted to my van. I didn't look back until I was halfway down the street. When I finally glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the man and the two others standing in the doorway, just watching me drive away. I called my boss as soon as I was far enough away, telling him the job was a prank and the house was abandoned. He didn't seem too concerned, just told me to move on to the next call. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Later that night, I looked up the address and found out the house had been foreclosed years ago and was still listed as vacant. I reported the incident to the police, but I never heard anything back. I stayed with that company for a few more months, but I never took another job in that part of town again. Something about that house and those people still haunts me to this day. It was back in 2020 when I worked for a small local pizza place. It wasn't a big chain like Domino's or Pizza Hut, just a family-owned spot that had been around for decades. I had just started working there because I needed extra cash for rent and groceries. It was my second night on the job, and I was still being trained. The manager, a guy named Rick, was showing me the ropes, and like the first night, he was accompanying me on deliveries to make sure I got the hang of it. That night, we got an order for 3 large pizzas and a couple of 2-liter sodas. The address was on the outskirts of town, in a rural area I wasn't familiar with. Rick looked at the address and muttered something about it being a bit far, but he didn't seem too concerned. We loaded the pizzas into my car, and Rick came along for the ride. It was just the 2 of us, since the other employees were busy back at the shop. The drive took about 25 minutes, and as we got closer to the location, the houses became fewer and farther apart. Eventually, we turned onto a long gravel driveway that led to a house surrounded by dense woods. The house itself looked ancient, like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the porch sagged under its own weight. There were no lights on, and the whole place gave off an unsettling vibe. I parked the car, and Rick told me to grab the pizzas while he carried the sodas. As we approached the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods around us were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under our feet. When we got to the front door, Rick knocked, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and we waited. After a few moments, we heard shuffling from inside and the door creaked open just a crack. A woman peeked out. She looked to be in her 40s, but her face was pale and her eyes were sunken, like she hadn't slept in days. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at us. Rick finally broke the silence and said we had her order. She nodded slowly and opened the door wider, motioning for us to come inside. I hesitated, but Rick stepped in, so I followed. The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sour. The furniture was old and covered in dust, and there were strange symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like charcoal. The woman told us to wait in the living room while she got the money. Rick and I exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything. As we stood there, I noticed something on the floor near the corner of the room. It was a pile of what looked like animal bones, arranged in a strange pattern. I nudged Rick and pointed it out, and his face went pale. Before we could say anything, we heard footsteps upstairs. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. Rick called out to the woman, asking if someone else was home, but she didn't respond. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, we heard a loud thud, like something heavy had been dropped. Rick grabbed my arm and whispered that we should leave. But just as we turned to go, the woman reappeared. She was holding a wad of cash and smiling, but there was something off about her smile. It was too wide, too forced. She handed the money to Rick and thanked us, but before we could leave, she said, "You should stay for a while. They'll be here soon." Rick didn't ask what she meant. He just muttered something about needing to get back to the shop and practically dragged me out the door. As we walked back to the car, I glanced up at one of the upstairs windows and froze. There was someone standing there watching us. I couldn't make out their face, but their silhouette was tall and thin, and they didn't move. We got into the car, and Rick told me to drive. As we sped down the driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the woman standing on the porch, still smiling, with the figure from the window now standing behind her. Neither of them moved as we drove away. When we got back to the shop, Rick told me not to mention what happened to anyone. He said he'd handle it, but I could tell he was shaken. I quit the job a week later, and I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder who or what was upstairs and what the woman meant when she said, "They'll be here soon."